I am Kevin Gorman. I'm leading the HR data transformation at Wells Fargo. Still a little new in the role. Just got to Wells about 8 months or so ago, right at the end of the year last year. And we're really just kind of getting going, at least in the HR space, with doing some real AI. And so what I'll talk about a lot today is really how to kind of get going from ground zero in parts of the organization that maybe aren't super data savvy, super analytical, or highly quant by nature. So my experience in the HR space about the last 6 or 7 years, have done data science teams in technology, kind of been on the business side, doing credit and marketing analytics, found my way into HR where there's just a ton of just phenomenally interesting and fun problems and really tricky space. So with that, what is people analytics? So for those of you who may not be HR professionals, the way that I would define it, and I think a lot of people would define it maybe slightly differently, it's really about data and analytics in support of your workforce and in support of driving competitive advantage through talent, right? Lasting, sustainable competitive advantage. As such, like super fun and super interesting problem space to work with, really all about the kind of end-to-end hire to retire kind of cycle of talent, right? Addressing some of the critical questions. How do I attract the best talent? How do I reward them? How do I engage them? How do I retain them? And what do I continue to kind of do to grow them? So tricky kind of nuanced problems and challenging problems to really understand. And then lots and lots and lots of nuanced data, right? So this is a space where you're likely to deal with lots of small data problems, right? Like who's the best candidate to be the next CEO of the company, right? Not a huge big data problem. Lots of data quality and data completeness issues, right? There's just a lot of things that you can't capture about your talent. You've got lots of really unstructured text data, right? So really tricky data. HR is probably the only place that I've worked which will allow you to edit history, right? So if somebody was supposed to have been hired 2 weeks ago, we'll just fake it in the system that they were hired 2 weeks ago. And so you've got these really interesting kind of challenging historical data problems, technical problems, and it makes kind of doing AI tricky and requires kind of strong foundation building for those. Obviously, lots and lots of regulatory oversight, banking industry for one, and then people-related challenges and problems for two. And so you get lots of regulator interest for this. And the field itself is still quite new. It borrows pretty liberally from lots of other fields. I've done that a ton myself throughout my career. But not a huge kind of wealth of well-established methodology out there as compared to making credit decisions, making marketing decisions, other kind of more quant-heavy spaces. So the other kind of big challenge that you see in the HR space is data literacy among key stakeholders and decision makers, right? So the HR field is one that's generally pretty heavily focused on people-related elements, right? Organizational design, interactions of people. It's a kind of more qualitative and less quant for the bulk of the skills that your average HR professional is kind of bringing to the table. And even you see kind of on the graph there on the right, fairly limited numbers of companies doing really aggressive data-driven decision-making in this space. And so you've got kind of a little bit of challenge, right? Like a little bit of headwind in some of this that you've got to overcome, right? And so how do you think about kind of really building that strategy and getting going with AI? You've got a complex problem space. You've got data quality and completeness issues, low data literacy stakeholders and decision makers, lots of regulator attention, and a super complex vendor landscape. And so what I propose, and I think I've heard a lot of similar kinds of themes as I've listened to other talks throughout the day today, but like ultimately it is building a really compelling case for change in this space, right? And doing so with stakeholders that may not have a firm grasp for the underlying technology or feel tremendously confident, comfortable making data-driven decisions. Lots of strengthening of foundational data ecosystems, right? Big gaps in the data, garbage in, garbage out. And so a big heavy focus on getting the data in shape. Guiding the organization, right? Big skills changes, not just for those who are doing the analytics and doing the model development. That's one piece of it. But how do I, as a recruiter or as a recruiting leader or as a learning and development professional, start to incorporate more of this into my day-to-day work, right? There's a lot of change management in this. And then finally, how do I establish the right governance and the right controls in this space to ensure that we don't end up on the front page of the New York Times for having done something particularly sketchy or that in retrospect looks sketchy. So establish those governance practices. The initial case building for kind of making the case for AI, I try to think about as four big components of focus here, right? I think heard it from probably some of the other talks throughout the day today and some of the keynotes, but really kind of having a strategy-led approach to this space, right? It's not science project territory, right? Like you don't want to get stuck in doing things just for the sake of doing them or because they're cool, right? They are fun, but you really need to kind of drive impact. And so being really dialed into the overall organizational strategy with the use cases that you select, being able to kind of quantify those benefits, right? So HR is a very heavily kind of qualitative space, but much can be quantified and you can kind of tie back to key metrics that matter and make the case for how I will shorten time from initially contacting a candidate to getting them on board and being productive. You know, how can I improve my engagement, inclusion scores, retention of my top talent, right? So you can start to quantify that. You can really cultivate that willingness to implement, right? Making the business case for it. How's it going to make lives easier? How is it going to simplify things? Really being thoughtful around how you'll manage the risk of that, right? Do I want to have human in the loop kind of decision making? Do I want to allow a model, an AI to make the decisions on its own? And then build out that multi-year roadmap, right? Get people excited about where things are going over the long haul. But you also have to kind of deliver value in the interim, right? Focusing on the quick wins where you can develop, value or demonstrate value really early on with the data that you've got, with the limitations that you might have in your data, right? And so in the HR space, there are lots of things that aren't necessarily specific to HR, right? There are things that are important broadly and are much more mature and have good vendor solutions, right? So lots of contact center type stuff. Lots of process mining kind of work and efficiencies. So kind of thinking about, well, what could I deliver value with in 6 months, given my current data environment, given my limitations, given the skills that I've got on the team, and start to package that together, right? Because I think the important part for HR customers, especially, given that they won't necessarily have the same kind of, nerdy affinity for some of the space that we might all have, is making sure that they're seeing those demonstrations of value along the way, even if you're going to need to invest for some years in cleaning up your data environment. Thinking about how to narrow down the scope of things. Maybe it's really about succession planning for a handful of key roles or about finding ROI in some of your development programs, things like that. So easier if you can kind of like dial back the scope of your work. To still kind of put together something that is compelling, but deliverable with current techniques, current technology, and the data that you've got as it is. Buy versus build philosophy, right? There's obviously key sets of decisions that we all need to kind of make around what are we going to build out? What are we going to go out to market and find vendors for? But really kind of having a good assessment of that. And then even borrow within your company. So in the HR space, you generally aren't going to have a ton of HR specific data scientists or foundational models or other things like that in the space. But you might have the ability to borrow from other more mature parts of the organization, right? Finding ways to incorporate, chatbot technologies that are being used in customer facing ways into your back office. Finding ways to slightly adjust predictive models to focus on similar concepts, right? Lots of borrowing opportunities within larger enterprises where you can take advantage of some of the deeper work that may be being done on more kind of front and center revenue producing parts of the business. And then really kind of understanding for your use cases, what do you need, right? Like, do you need to go out and build things that are going to be super high barrier to entry, or can you lean on vendors in this space? I think you're seeing, certainly in the HR space, lots and lots of vendors are kind of going down this pathway. I think even just today, one of the prominent vendors in the space, One Model, announced some new funding explicitly focused on some AI capabilities. So Very exciting, I think, kind of work. And likely a pretty exciting vendor landscape in this space as you kind of move forward here in the next couple of years. Key HRIS vendors are certainly looking at AI capabilities. Workday, in particular, has a bunch of work that they are focused on as well. And then finally, what's my test and learn agenda, right? How am I going to keep kind of iterating and building on this work? Are there ways that we can kind of start to do proofs of value or proofs of concept with key technology partners or with key vendor partners? Can we do small scale experimentation, right? Can we look to start doing people experiments in this space and look for new opportunities, new ways of getting value out of that? And are there places where we would explicitly kind of craft our test and learn agenda to help build the org's capabilities in AI, right? Do we want to establish some tiger teams, start testing out new technologies, start playing around with things? And can we create some of those virtuous cycles of continuing to innovate while also building team skills, right? So very, very important, I think, to have that truly holistic AI strategy kind of targeted to your business strategy and thoughtful about creating both short-term and long-term value in this. So as you've got the strategy together and you've started kind of cultivating that buy-in with key stakeholders, it'll become very clear that there's a tremendous amount of foundational data work to be done here. And so I've been in the HR space at three kind of larger companies. All of them have had their own kind of unique challenges with the data ecosystem that they had at the time. In some cases, you think about HR processes and whether they're even generating the data that you need to have, right? Oftentimes, recruiters might maintain a list of candidates in an Excel spreadsheet sitting somewhere on their machine rather than, in your candidate tracking system where you want. So you've got gaps and holes in your processes, right? You've got to get, people moved into the right systems. You've got to instrument the aspects of your process that you want to generate data around. Consolidation, right? A number of the companies that I've worked with have built themselves up through a tremendous amount of acquisition activity and not always having done the consolidation in back-end systems. At the other end of that, you might have 2 or 3 or 5 HRIS systems. Some of them may store their historical data in stacks of Post-it notes, right? Like if you've bought smaller companies, but really kind of building some of that out and starting to then build the connections between different systems, right? I have a strategic workforce planning system that feeds into my recruiting pipelines and my learning and development platforms. And how do I kind of create the thread across each of those different systems as I hop back and forth? The organization might not have been super deliberate about setting it up that way in the first place. And so you need to kind of come back and make sure you've got the linkages where you want those linkages. Centralizing the data, right? I've come into places where generally we haven't had any real centralized system, right? We've had, confederation constellation of different systems sitting kind of all over the place, which are very kind of difficult to get at. You got an Oracle data warehouse somewhere over here. You've got another operational data store on Postgres over there. But starting to really kind of consolidate with a really good working data model, all of that HR data in one place, easily queryable, easily tied into business systems so that you can really kind of understand the value. Lots of things that you might want to know in HR are dependent on business performance, right? Like, was this salesperson a good hire or not? Well, I need to know, are they generating revenue? Are they generating leads? Are they making money? Are they hitting their KPIs, right? And so being able to then connect back into on a shared data lake kind of construct, the key business systems that are going to be important are going to generate useful signals or outcome metrics that will be important to you. And then finally, really strengthening the data quality practices, right? Again, if you're not already doing a tremendous amount of reporting activity, analytical activity, you may not have thoughtful processes around data quality. You may have some thoughtful processes around data quality and then big gaps in perceptions of data quality that need to be addressed. You might have big gaps in your data quality, big holes in your data quality that need to be addressed directly. And so being really thoughtful about establishing the quality rules throughout the ETL, building data quality transparency into the reporting so that people are much more comfortable now with the black box system generating, an insight or recommendation for them if they know the data can be trusted, the connections are there, they can see things in a more readily interpretable kind of reporting format. And so for us, right, this is a big area of focus right now. I've definitely had kind of multi-year roadmaps just around getting data issues out of the system and getting data quality into the system. All right. Lastly, kind of the key aspects of kind of undergoing this transformation in an area of the business that's not already really, data savvy is a lot of work kind of foundationally training the organization and spending time not just with the doers, the people who are going to be hands-on keyboard and writing code, but also with the decision makers, right? Getting kind of key data literacy training in place for your end users, making sure that they're comfortable with the ability to leverage AI-driven decisions into their day-to-day jobs, that they can go and track their own progress. Really just kind of making sure that folks have what they need to be effective customers, effective collaborators on model builds. And then to eventually leverage it, right? If you get, no adoption, if you've got lots of like human in the loop decision-making processes like you'll have in an HR context, like you really do need to ensure that everybody knows how to use these things and feels comfortable, confident enough if they're looking at, outputs from a topic model or a large language model synthesis of survey results. What can they trust? What do they need to interrogate? What do they need to think differently about? For the folks that will be more hands-on keyboard, you're probably kind of building a little bit the org from scratch, right? Or you're begging and borrowing from other parts of the organization. So how do you kind of establish an academy for those who are going to be the doers in this space going forward and ensure that they've got like the depth and breadth of technical skill that they're going to need to be successful in their roles? This kind of a transformation implies just a tremendous amount of process change, right? As I was saying, right, if I'm a recruiter, I might now have a co-pilot instead of a regular search engine generating back results from a knowledge library. I might need to think entirely differently about what my work looks like. And then finally, right, big global talent model changes, right? So if the day-to-day grunt work of recruiting that was mostly talking back and forth with candidates, pulling up answers, crafting offers. If you can do a lot of that automatically, right? Like, how does that role change? Does it now emphasize different skills, right? That's going to be an important consideration, for this organization. And then governance. As you think about the governance needs in this space, right? You don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times. So how do you ensure you've got like basic data governance activities going on? You're being thoughtful about data quality, data cataloging, data security. You're kind of thinking about your ethical boundaries, right? Do I want to do a big, passive O&A exercise? Is that too creepy? Am I comfortable collecting metadata? Am I comfortable collecting everything, right? Like different companies will have different perspectives on this, right? Kind of finding the right one for your industry, for your company is key. In banking, model risk management is a pretty common practice. When I was in telco, it was not. They were just kind of building out model risk management at that point. And so really strengthening that, making sure you've got the appropriate kind of model risk guardrails and guidelines, and then building out your vendor management philosophy, right? How are you going to kind of manage the vendors in this space? How are you going to kind of think about that? So as I mentioned, kind of 4 key building blocks to all of this, right? You got to make the case, you got to strengthen your data, you got to train and change the organization, and then you've got to govern this thing appropriately. But in pulling all of those things together, you can kind of drive pretty transformational change on pretty technical data savvy topics in a non-technical or non-data savvy part of the organization. And I think that is it for me and for my time. I appreciate it, everybody. Thanks for time.